Welcome back to the Money with Katie show, Rich Girls and Boys. I'm your host, Katie Gaddy Tassan, and today we're discussing the hidden costs of living with a disability. Unlike many other minority groups, this is a group that any person can join at any time and will likely be part of at some point in their lives, whether through an accident, an illness, a genetic condition, or the inevitable process of aging. Disabilities can be visible or invisible. They can completely change your life or only impact certain aspects of it. But we often don't discuss the costs associated with living with a disability. There are the obvious costs like healthcare and accessibility devices, but there are also costs that accompany outfitting a home properly, paying for care and assistance from a human if necessary, as anyone with an aging parent or a child with a disability knows. The challenges of mobility and transportation if the disability is physical, and more. And because this isn't a topic that I have firsthand experience with, Jenny Burke and Kelsey Ibach of the Inclusive Traveler are joining me today. They run an accessibility-focused travel community that spreads awareness about living with a disability. So, we'll be right back after a message from the sponsors of today's episode. Okay, friends, it is that time again. Yep, I am talking about tax season. And you can take the stress out of filing by using TaxAct. Getting started is easy thanks to TaxAct's step-by-step guidance. And if you used a different provider last year, you can upload a PDF of your return to easily switch. Whether you're new to TaxAct or a previous filer, they will help you get the most out of your taxes, like your maximum refund, guaranteed. And you can rest easy knowing the math adds up. If they make a mistake, TaxAct's $100,000 accuracy guarantee will pay out up to $100,000 to cover the error. That is the strongest accuracy guarantee in the industry. Get your return started at taxact.com/moneywithkatie. That's TAXACT.com/moneywithkatie. Jenny, Kelsey, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the Inclusive Traveler, y'all talk a bit about visible versus invisible disabilities. Can you share more about what that generally means, as well as the role that identity plays in this distinction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So a disability is any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. So by definition, that includes both physical and mental conditions, but most of society associates a disability with something that they can visibly see, like a wheelchair user, missing limbs, a blind person, etc. But there are so many invisible disabilities, like autism, ADHD, MS, a chronic illness, OCD, dyslexia, just to name a few. So since many people who might have those invisible disabilities probably have never considered themselves in that category, they may have internalized ableism. So ableism is when a society system defines an abled person as the standard and normal, and anyone who does not fit that standard is believed to be lesser value and not as worthy. So for me personally, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis in 2011, and I never considered myself as having a disability because it wasn't something you couldn't see. So it wasn't until recently that I've started to go on this journey to really tap into that side of myself, because I think a major thing was when I learned that ulcerative colitis is an uncurable disease. I'll have it for the rest of my life. It was very jarring moment that it's something that I really should lean into a lot more and not ignore like I had done so much in the past. And I'm so thankful for the people that I've met in the disabled community.
And while Jenny has an invisible disability, I have a visible disability. And so a lot of our experiences are different, but in many ways that they're the same. And I think it's important to note when we're talking about identity as it relates to disability, it often, from an outside perspective, may come with a negative connotation. And something that I think it's really important that we get across to the listeners today and the non-disabled community is that most disabled people are actually proud of their disability and proud to call themselves disabled. But we believe that the biggest hurdle is not necessarily being the disabled person or our disability themselves, but that we live in an inaccessible society.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so that's kind of what I want to dig into with you today, because 1 in every 4 adults in the US lives with a disability. And as I said in the introduction, this is a minority group that most people will probably find themselves in at some point or another in their lives, whether temporarily or permanently. And given that, there's a lot of value in talking openly about the costs and the challenges that are a part of this that you may need to plan for. Can you share a few of the financial implications that you've come across?
So I became disabled at age 25 pretty unexpectedly, which means that my life was basically turned on its head overnight. And because I had never really planned for having a disability, especially this young in my life, it meant that I needed to make some major changes, and that came with a price, right? So I all of a sudden overnight needed to find accessible housing. I currently live in Chicago. I lived in Chicago at the time, and that meant finding a building with an elevator, which often means that it comes with a higher price. There's those high cost amenities that you get with an elevator building here in Chicago. Larger space meant that it was a higher cost of rent. I needed a custom fit wheelchair, which costs thousands of dollars to get. I racked up medical supplies costs just to be able to go to the bathroom, to be able to shower, and you'd be surprised to find out that most insurance companies don't cover those ancillary costs. Even though they're technically medically necessary, they don't say that it is. So a lot of this was coming out of my own pocket. I needed accessible transportation to and from my physical therapy appointments, doctor's appointments. I think I spent close to $100K my first year out of the hospital, just on maintaining a similar lifestyle to the one that I had before, and then getting to all these new appointments that I had in my life. Now, also keep in mind, because this was an unexpected disability due to an accident, I also was out of work for the better part of a year. And because of how young and naive I was hadn't signed up for long-term disability. So I was completely out of an income after 6 months when my short-term disability ran out. And not only that, I'm now planning, I work with a financial planner now to kind of have a more forward-thinking approach. I've learned my lesson, right? Because I know that while I've become extremely independent with my disability now, as I age, I know that I will start to lose some of that independence, which means that I'll have even more costs, as my life moves on.
I'm really surprised to hear that your health insurance did not deem these things medically necessary. That is incredibly concerning.
I was like, do I need to send in a picture of myself? How does one work around that?
You mentioned too, you highlighted something really crucial there, which is you had an accident that turned your life upside down unexpectedly. And because in the United States, it is very common for your health insurance to be tied to your employment, because of the accident, you mentioned you now were out of work for a while and that your income went away. But that also, I assume, means that you were probably thrust into a situation where your health insurance also became somewhat precarious.
I also have an education that allowed me to push back on some of these costs, to navigate the healthcare system, that I had, friends and family that would sit down and help me navigate these new costs, bills, insurance claims. But for a lot of folks, that's not the case. And it's a really, really, really tough world to be thrust into.
Oh, I can't even imagine, especially the fact that you can put a number on it too is pretty eye-opening, really, that, year one out of the hospital, you're estimating at around $100,000 out of pocket. That's just, that's unbelievable. That's close to the median net worth of the average American. So to think that it's that expensive to go through something like that is just really disappointing. So, Kelsey, can you talk a little bit more about your story?
So, at age 25, I was out at the bars, just like most mid-20s people are. And I was celebrating a friend's birthday that night, decided that, we were going to call it a night, get into a cab. This was even before Ubers, so I'm dating myself a little bit. But a friend who had been working at the bar that night offered myself and a few other friends a ride home instead. So a few of us got into his car while the others took a cab. And because he had been working that night, I was under the assumption that he had not been drinking. I, of course, found out later that I was very wrong. So we only made it a few blocks before we hit an embankment at high speed, fell over the embankment, landed upside down, down on train tracks below. And I immediately knew that something was wrong. I couldn't feel anything from my chest down. I wasn't necessarily in pain, but I just knew something was not right. I had to have my friends take me out of the car because I couldn't, of course, get up and walk myself. And the driver of the accident actually fled the scene without calling 911. Thankfully, there was a AAA driver nearby that had seen the whole thing, and so he had called an ambulance. And I was eventually rushed to the hospital to find out that I had broken 5 vertebrae, 7 ribs, broken pelvis, and a collapsed lung, and I needed to go into immediate emergency surgery. And right before I rolled into surgery, the doctor came in to tell me that I most likely will never walk again, that I had a spinal cord injury affecting my movement and feeling from about the belly button down, and that my life, I think it was something that always stuck with me, is that he said, this is a life-altering event, not life-ending event. And I think that I used some of that to power me through what would be the next few weeks, the next few weeks, months, and years of my life. So I spent about a couple weeks in the ICU, followed by 3 months in an overnight rehab facilitation, learning how to do things like get dressed, sit up, use a wheelchair, cook food, do those day-to-day activities that we kind of take for granted. But in those few early days, I never thought that I could travel, that I could have kids, that I could date, that I could work, that I could live independently, I could drive. And now, 8 years later, I do all of those things without thinking about it, and then some. And that's a huge reason why Jenny and I are so passionate about our community, is to kind of show the highlights of having a disability and what that looks like.
I just thank you for your vulnerability and for sharing that, and ultimately for the work that you guys are doing now, because I know it's going to make, and already has made, a really big difference. Thank you. We're going to take a pause right here, and we will be right back after a message from the sponsors of today's episode. We recently partnered with TaxAct to create a custom episode of the Money with Katie show, all about changes that you should be aware of in tax season 2023. The full episode is up on our YouTube page, but we're also going to be playing excerpts during our other episodes for the next few weeks in lieu of traditional advertisements. So here's a little bit of my conversation with TaxAct's Vice President of Tax Operations, Mark Yeager. All right, let's talk about some common tax season misconceptions. First of all, my favorite, extensions. If you file an extension, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so you have until April 18th here in 2023 to file your tax return. Now, what an extension provides you is an opportunity to wait to file that tax return until October 15th, depending on if it falls on a holiday or a weekend, really a weekend. So with that, what the misconception is that, well, because I filed for an extension, I no longer need to pay my tax liability until October 15th. And that is 100% untrue, right? The IRS and the federal government still wants their money, right? And they want their money on time. So the April 18th deadline for this year still requires you to pay what you're going to owe for the year.
I hope you enjoyed that excerpt from our conversation. Now, back to our regularly scheduled programming, and as always, happy tax season. So let's talk a little bit more about this community that you guys run, the Inclusive Traveler, because it focuses on spreading awareness about people with disabilities and making travel specifically more accessible, which you've already kind of mentioned. This is something that you did not think you were going to be able to participate in anymore. And when I think about my average day at the airport and all the walking and the standing and the getting on trains and getting in Ubers and sitting on the plane and going to the bathroom on the plane and just everything involved, I realize how much I take my ability to navigate that system without assistance for granted. Can you speak to some of the major considerations and costs that go into making something like travel more accessible? And maybe that journey that you took once you started to realize that this is something that you can still do. It's just going to look a little bit different now.
The biggest consideration that I had when deciding to travel again after becoming disabled was the amount of time that it takes that goes into planning. So, even as something as simple as booking a hotel room, beforehand, I was typically just going on to, Marriott's website and finding the best available price and hotel room. You can do it all there from your computer. There's plenty of websites or hotel websites that don't even have the accessibility option. I have to pick up the phone and call. So I'm constantly following up to make sure that even if I can book via the website, that I'm following up and making sure that it truly is accessible, that they have the stuff that I need, that the doors are wide enough, that there's a chair in the bathroom for me to take a shower, those sorts of things. I'm constantly planning ahead in my itinerary extra time to get to certain tourist attractions or places that I need to be, because oftentimes city transportation isn't always accessible. So that means that I need to bake in more time to get there with a cab or an Uber or arrange some other mode of transportation. There are some cost perks to being disabled. So we've found traveling together that, a lot of tourist attractions are free for people with disabilities for either themselves and their companion. We also found in Paris that all the public bus transportation was completely free for people with disabilities and their companions. So while the train was completely inaccessible for us to get around, we often used the buses because they were free and accessible.
There was trains like the Eurorail to go from London to Paris. We took that. We were able to get business class for the only cost of a coach ticket. So that was another benefit, if you will. And we're always the front of the line for different attractions that we wanted to go to. We went to Versailles. I forced Kelsey to go to the Harry Potter platform 9 with me, and we got to go to the front. So those are, again, a few little things that were positive.
Now, I want to also point out one thing that I'm extremely passionate about when it comes to air travel and the costs there. So while there isn't necessarily a higher cost to pre-board or to, book a seat on a flight, something that we're seeing consistently in the wheelchair community, we technically have to leave our chairs behind as we board a plane, and those get stowed underneath the plane. And you can imagine, if you've seen what happens to your luggage under the plane, what can happen to wheelchairs while stowed under the plane with untrained folks that are, putting them together, folding them, taking them apart. So I think in the US alone, I want to say it's roughly 26 wheelchairs get completely damaged every day. And that means that some folks are out of their main mode of mobility for months. Because like I mentioned earlier, these are custom fit wheelchairs. We can't just be put in these chairs that they give you at the airport. We're at risk for pressure sores, or they're so heavy that our shoulders don't have the power to propel them forward. We completely lose our independence without our wheelchairs. So that's a huge thing that we're advocating for in the disabled community, is to have better accommodations so that we don't have to leave our chairs in the hands of untrained employees.
Oh my gosh. I saw in one of your videos that you have an air tag on your chair.
Yes.
And I was like, that is so smart, because I can only imagine how stressful that would be to part with a wheelchair as you're boarding a plane where you're going somewhere new. It may be into another country in the case of y'all's European travel, and to land and to not have that guarantee that it's going to be in the same condition. I mean, that's not just a financial burden, but as you mentioned, like, it could be months before you are given your mobility back again.
Absolutely.
The other thing that your videos, so I have some bathroom anxiety, which I will share with the community. But if I'm somewhere where I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know the next time I'm gonna be able to go to the bathroom, it like makes me have to go to the bathroom. TMI. But anyway, all that to say, one of your videos, you were rating accessible bathrooms around Europe, which I thought was so funny. It's like, oh, this one, like 4 out of 10, no mirror. Like, oh, this one is whatever. And it really struck me, though, because I was like, wow, there's so much extra care and consideration that has to go into planning anytime you're going to deviate from your routine. Because even if you're in a place that maybe has a bathroom, if you physically can't even get into it, that's gonna be a trip ruiner or a day ruiner. It's gonna add a level of inconvenience. I mean, it's just, your account has made me start to notice things that I have never noticed before. And I think that as somebody that is not part of the disabled community, it's been really valuable for me personally. It's given me a much deeper appreciation for these things.
On the bathroom anxiety, you're talking to the right person, because part of ulcerative colitis is like, it's an inflammatory bowel disease. And so in a flare-up, I can't control my bowel movements. So there could be a time that I would go to the bathroom 12 times in one day. So when we're talking about travel, where you're saying I have anxiety if I'm on a long bus, there's not a bathroom, I have anxiety leaving my apartment or like leaving a hotel, not knowing if there's a bathroom that, especially in Europe, a lot of bathrooms you have to pay. Like if it's a public bathroom, you have to pay. So have coins on you. If they have toilet paper, some don't have toilet paper. Am I going to make it to that place in time? So I won't eat potentially for like a full day if I'm in a flare up, because I want to avoid that.
How can we all advocate for better accommodations and better policies, knowing that many of us will be affected at some point in our lifetimes?
So in the workplace, if you have the ability in your HR system to self-ID that you have a disability, very important to do so. Most of it will be private, so it doesn't necessarily have to be shared with your manager. But if for some reason you do want to request accommodations, having that data there is super important. And it's a stigma that employers might think that an employee requesting accommodations would be really expensive and a big hassle, but most of the time it's less than $500, so it's really cost effective. And putting positive things in place can affect other people, other allies who don't have a disability. When you're walking on a sidewalk, curb cuts are technically not legally required in some cities, but it's hindrance for some people who can't go on the sidewalk. But you can think about it makes a positive impact for other people as well to more easily move around. Like if you think about strollers, or if you think about someone with low vision.
I also think when we're speaking of accessible infrastructure, I think there's a stigma too that like old historic buildings can't be updated to meet the needs of some physical barriers. But we even found in Europe some of the oldest buildings have been retrofitted with elevators, and they could hide them away technically if you'd like to. Like when we went to the Palace of Versailles, there's plenty of elevators. They of course did not have that back in the day. So I think that there's a stigma that it's too difficult to make these changes, too difficult to speak up. But I think it's important that even as people without disabilities, that if you see something, say something. If you go into it now when you go into a bar or restaurant, a store, and you're seeing that there's a lip to get in, or maybe that the workers are illegally parking in the disabled parking stall, say something. Because disabled people are often get fatigued on being the only ones bringing these issues up. So as you're learning more about the community and how it benefits, like Jenny said, not even just the disabled community, but helps other folks, the curb cutout being one of them for moms with strollers. I think it just, it has a positive trickle down to other groups as well.
What did I not ask you about today that you want people to know?
I would say that it's super important to have allies, and we just want to encourage people that you can still go travel. You can still go do a lot of fun things that you want to experience. Just because this is happening, your disability is either permanent, situational, temporary. You can still live a very full life. So we just want to make sure that we're encouraging people to do that.
And when asked if you want the long-term disability, say yes.
Can't thank you guys enough for being here, for your bravery, vulnerability, everything that you are doing to spread the word.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, y'all, that is all for this week. Before we go, comment below what you thought the most interesting part of this conversation was, and remember to like and subscribe to our channel if the spirit moves you. And I'll see you next week, same time, same place on The Money with Katie Show. Our show is a production of Morning Brew and is produced by Henna Velez and me, Katie Gatti-Tassan. Devin Emery is our Chief Content Officer, and our video editors are Christy Muldoon, Sebastian Vega, and Nicole Friedman. Additional fact-checking comes from Kate Brandt. And don't forget, if you enjoyed the excerpts from today's episode, my conversation with Mark Yeager from Tax Act, to visit my YouTube channel to hear the full conversation and learn even more tips to help you file confidently this year.